I think we'll give people maybe one more minute. We've still got people that are questions about Esser, and so I really am grateful to Sarah for bringing it to you, and then there will be time at the end for your questions. So we appreciate everything you're doing and your concern about using these. Oh.
All right, Becky, do you want to go ahead and get started? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yes. So because the question was asked, let me just address it. In terms of this session, we will be recording it and sharing it so that you have it for both your future reference as well as for individuals who weren't able to attend today. We know it's spring break time for many of our LEAs and appreciate those of you who were able to join us. So I am excited to go ahead and get started for today. All right. So as far as the conversation goes, we're really going to look to provide you an overview of all the COVID-19 federal relief funding that has thus far been received by the Utah State Board of Education. And so this will provide you kind of a really big landscape of everything that has been received thus far so that you can start to think about, so what does that landscape then mean for my local LEA and our needs in terms of addressing COVID-19. At the end of this, a couple of things. Number one, we will be sharing the slide deck, so you are welcome to use it as a resource moving forward. But second of all, we'll also leave time for questions and answers at the end. I will note, since it is being recorded, that if you do ask questions, we will answer them in a public setting. So if you ever have a question where you're like, I don't want that on the recording for one reason or another, or have additional details you want to provide us as context, you're always welcome to reach out to Dr. Donaldson and myself, and we are happy to provide you individual support off the recording. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm sure this is going to sound like a broken record to many of you when it comes to the conversation about how title funds are used in general in K-12 education. But one of the things that I think continues to be a challenge, and so we just want to address it straight up, is that the question is not what can I spend it on? Because honestly, for many of these federal funds, that scope is very, very broad. And the reason for that is that our policymakers really noted that the impacts of COVID-19 are going to differ, not just at the state level, but at the local level, and even at the local level, different across schools in terms of what the needs are and what we need to do to respond. So as we start to talk about these funds today, I really encourage you to shift away from this question and instead towards this lens. So how can I use this funding to demonstrate what would happen if we increased investment in education? This is your moment to take those best practices, those, opportunities that you've said, I've always wanted to be able to provide this type of support and resources for our students and our teachers, and to not just have a single year to fund it, but actually multiple years due to the funding structure and the allowable timeframe around these funds. If you think about it through that lens, you can also look at it through the lens of then making a case, not just for your local LEA, but also for the state in terms of looking at, are there things that we need to continue to fund because we've been able to show such great success and impact on our students and teachers. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this slide deck, and we'll revisit that at the very end. So in terms of K-12 COVID-19 funding relief, it's important to note we used to always just call it the CARES money. And that's because CARES was truly the first piece of legislation that came through in May of 2020 in response. Since then, there's been a lot more legislation that has been passed. And so we really use the COVID-19 relief funding as an umbrella. And we'll note that there's a lot of different individual components, and each of those individual funding streams is going to have a slightly different use case related to them. And we just want to make sure, again, that you have the full landscape of all of these as you start to make decisions about what next steps look like for your community. So let's start with round one, which was CARES. So this is the original funding that was received both by the state and by our LEAs in May through September of 2020, depending on when your application was approved. So it's important to note that the Esser 1 and Gear 1 programs that were a part of the CARES Act must be spent by September 30th, 2022. We'll talk more about the timing of that funding and what it means for some of your future awards as well. But it is important to highlight, so I'll say it again, September 30th, 2022. That seems like a far way away, but it's really looking like knocking on our door in terms of being a year out. So this is the money that will have to be spent first in terms of next steps. So for the most part, when we look at all of the money that was received during the CARES awarding cycle, it breaks down into a couple of different components. So the first one is the Esser 90%. These are the funds that were distributed using the federal distribution formula of Title 1A allocations to our LEAs across the state. So in total, that award was over $61 million to the field. And the amount that we have reimbursed thus far, it's important to note, is a little under $38 million, or about 61%. I highlight that because it is possible that your LEA still has additional funds that maybe you had intended to use towards procuring PPE, but it turned out that the state provided some, you received local donations, and so there may be available funding still in your ESSER 1 original award that needs to be obligated and used towards some of these use cases that we'll get into here in a little bit and consider. In addition to that, the second line on this chart speaks to the Esser 10% LEA base. So what's interesting is that because the federal government chose to use a Title 1A distribution, we had LEAs who do not receive Title I dollars, either because they do not qualify or they do not accept those funds. Recognizing that COVID-19 was an impact on all schools, regardless of the Title I population you serve, the Utah State Board of Education chose to establish a base. That meant that every single LEA in this case received a little over $21,000 in terms of having resources with which to help their community respond and rebound from COVID-19. Last but not least, we have the Gear Fund. And I like to highlight the Gear Fund because this is one where you'll see we actually have some of the lowest levels of reimbursement requests across all of the CARES funding. So as a reminder, the Gear funding is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, where the governor of the state of Utah, Governor Herbert at the time, had the opportunity to look at the K-16 landscape in Utah and make a decision about where he felt the funds were going to be the most impactful to addressing needs. The governor, in consultation with the Utah State Board of Education, chose to focus the funds on LEAs that had, previous to the pandemic, not been delivering remote-only based instruction as their primary vehicle for instruction for their students. So that qualified the majority of our LEAs for the Gear funds. In addition to that, these Gear funds are targeted at serving two distinct student population groups. The first one being students in special education. So noting that the COVID-19 pandemic and the move to suddenly remote only learning in March of 2020 of last year had a significant impact on that population, these funds were really targeted to be able to provide interventions, supports, and opportunities for those students, not just in regards to remote learning, but also in terms of returning to school as they've done this past fall. In addition to that, the other group that was identified was students at risk of academic failure. So again, noting that students who may have already been struggling in a school environment may have had those struggles exacerbated by moving to remote only learning in the spring of 2020, these funds were again meant to provide them additional supports. So every LEA has submitted a plan for these funds targeting those two groups. It is possible to submit a revised budget if you've recognized, we've noted that these students have different needs now than we were originally projecting in the summer of 2020. But it is important to note that all of those budget justifications have to be tied to serving those two student groups specifically. It can't be a school-wide treatment that then just happens to benefit those students as well. In addition to that, jumping down into the green, you'll see that we have a couple of grants that are highlighted in green that come from our state coronavirus relief fund, or CRF funding. So this was targeted by the Utah State Legislature in addition to the funds the state received specifically for K-12 to be able to address some immediate needs in terms of providing PPE to our schools through local grants. Coronavirus Relief Fund, the K-12 CRF, was about providing classroom supplies, enhancements, and equipment for our teachers and schools. For that one, I'll note that a lot of that focus was really recognizing that as our students returned to school, that there were things that we used to do as a school that may need to be modified. A really easy example is in elementary schools, having a box of crayons and markers in the center of the table that all the kids were reaching into and using as part of kind of their day-to-day learning opportunities. Moving to a space where each student had their own resources. So we were reducing those points of contact. That was really the focus, along with enhancements such as audio enhancements, recognizing that masks create a barrier for many of our students to be able to clearly hear their teacher and the directions that were happening. So what type of enhancements could we place in the classroom to help overcome those issues? And then equipment being the final one, noting that especially as many of our schools continued to offer remote and blended learning opportunities, that that technology piece was really essential to be able to meet the needs of our families and students. In addition to that, we have the San Juan Wi-Fi project, which focuses on providing broadband to students on the Navajo Nation, as well as high school testing. So this funding was really specific to being able to provide resources to our high schools who were offering rapid COVID-19 testing to their students in extracurricular activities, as well as their teachers in regard to responding to the state policy and guidance that was released in late November. All of those are highlighted in green because those funds expire on June 30th, 2021, so the end of the fiscal year. So this is one of those where if those funds are not requested for reimbursement, we will be turning them back over to the state, and they will be allocated to use cases most likely outside of K-12. So looking at those and noting that those resources are available to you, definitely worthwhile to again check in with your BAs or with the grants management system if you're a lead on that, and just see where you are in terms of making sure that those resources are obligated and you have a plan to spend them by June 30th of this year. All right, round two. So that felt like a lot. In our office, CARES was a lot. And so the fact that then there was another round, we were like, oh, okay, yes. In regards to being able to look forward, as opposed to CARES being really focused on triage and being able to kind of reopen schools in the fall, the second round of the Coronavirus Relief Supplemental Act that was passed in late December of 2020 released yet another round of funding, noting that our schools were still experiencing impacts due to COVID-19. So for these programs that we're going to touch on, it's important to note that the funds, both for Esser 2 and Gear 2, have to be spent by September 30th of 2023. So just as a friendly reminder, as is the case with other federal awards, an LEA has or will not be able to access their Esser 2 for reimbursement until they've completed their reimbursement requests and expenditures related to their Esser 1 award. This is also going to be the case for ESSER 3, which we will talk about here in a little bit. So we've had some questions about this. So to clarify, it means you can't seek reimbursement against the second award. It does not mean you can't start activities related to that award because the funding stream is approved. You just aren't able to actually seek reimbursement against that award until you've completely closed out your first one. So as far as ESSER 2 logistics goes, again, same distribution model with both the 90% as well as the state base. It's important to note that these awards were slightly more than 4 times the amount that was allocated in the original ESSER award. As a state, we received 67 million in CARES. We received 274 million in the second Supplemental Appropriations Act. So that means that the state base went from 21,000 to 84,000 plus for each LEA, meaning every single LEA has had the opportunity to receive at least $100,000 in regards to responding to COVID-19. This grant application was a little bumpy, which we'll talk about the timeline here in just a minute, but it was due to USBE on March 31st. That was Wednesday of last week. I do know that we have the majority of our LEAs having submitted, so thank you for taking action and getting those plans in. If your LEA is one of the few that missed that deadline, you need to reach out to our office because at this point the application is closed, and so we need to work with you directly on what those next steps look like. So as far as the ESSER 2 goes, it's important to note the COVID-19 requirement because I'm about to get into a lot of use cases. And when I look at the federal use cases, it can kind of seem like going shopping at Costco. There's just so many things that I need at my house that I didn't even think of until I walked into the store. And when you start to see all of these options, it can get a little overwhelming in terms of making really smart and targeted decisions that really address the needs of your community, as opposed to the like 4 bags of Cheerios that end up in my basket every single time, despite the fact that I'm the only one in my house that eats Cheerios. So along those lines, when looking at all of these opportunities that we're going to outline, you really need to look at it through the lens of the funding needs to take actions to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on students and families. So although there are a lot of use cases that are coming, they are all rooted in the lens that this is in response to needs that were exacerbated due to COVID-19. So that is the key element that has to be addressed before you can start the justification and planning for funds, is looking at what are our needs due to COVID-19 and how are we using these funds to respond to that. Now, I'm going to go through the federal use cases that we have outlined in ESSER 2. The reason I'm doing this, even though that application has closed, is that they all transfer forward to ESSER 3. And so I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of some of these items so that you can use it not only in terms of looking at potential budget revisions for ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, but also in your planning and moving forward related to the ESSER 3 award. So as far as the use cases go, these are all outlined in the applications that are shared through the grants management system. I'm not going to read them word for word, but I'll just highlight kind of the high levels of what each of these use cases speak to. So the first one is probably the most broad in regards to any activity that is already authorized under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, and specifically going through individual programs that are a part of that legislation and or separate but supportive of that legislation. So any of those activities that are already within the authorized scope of education through that federal legislation are potential use cases related to the CARES funding and federal funding more generally. Item 2 is going to be the coordination and preparedness of the response efforts for local education agencies with state, local, tribal, and territorial public health departments. And so it's important to note that we have become a lot closer with some of those health organizations related to tracking COVID numbers, considering what types of mitigation tactics need to be in place, and adhering to the policies of the state. So these resources are available to be able to continue those relationships and also be proactive about establishing opportunities for that coordination and time in advance of, a sudden emergency or a sudden spike in cases. 3 is going to be providing principals and other school leaders with resources necessary to address the needs in their individual schools. So like we started at the beginning, it's important to note that we realize, as does the legislation, that the needs are going to be different at every single school, and that it's important that there's flexibility towards meeting those needs. I will say, in regard to use case number 3, what is not acceptable is for an LEA to say, we're just going to distribute it to all of our schools, and that's the end of our plan. The reason I say that is because, back to the original guidance, it has to tie to COVID-19 mitigation. We need to see something in regards to the guidance that the LEA is providing related to allowable activities in response to COVID-19, so that as you distribute those funds and then are requesting reimbursement, you're in a space where those are allowable use cases, and we don't have school principals who didn't understand that component of it and spent on things that the state won't reimburse for. As far as 4 goes, it's really about activities to address the unique needs of some of our student populations that are articulated directly in this use case. Again, COVID-19 has had different impacts on different individuals across our K-12 education community, and some of the most extreme impacts are within these student subpopulations. So being able to establish programming and responses that are specific to meeting those students' needs is really important in terms of helping mitigate some of those impacts on both their learning as well as their access to the educational opportunities that your LEA offers. 5 is going to be developing and implementing procedures to improve preparedness and response efforts. So for a lot of our schools, this really looks like making sure that you have a system in place, not just around providing remote learning, but also being able to do school meal distribution, and looking at the different kind of efforts that we have as a community, so that if your school was to move into a quarantine space, that you had systems in place as well as resources related to making those happen without feeling in a scramble when those come up in the numbers. As far as 6 goes, this is training and professional learning for our staff and teachers on minimizing the spread of infectious disease. So in my teacher education program, which was many years ago, I will note they did not train us in sanitization and COVID-19 mitigation practices. So, and yet we're asking a lot of our teachers to operate within that realm, even in terms of just keeping their own classrooms safe and sanitary related to mitigating the spread of the potential viruses. So this provides funding to be able to support that professional learning, so that our teachers feel more confident in the use of those materials, especially a lot of times the storage of those materials, which, if you're working with young children and you have chemicals related to sanitization, there are specific protocols that our schools and teachers want to follow in terms of safety and making sure that we don't place any of our students at risk. I'll also note, in terms of the training and professional development, although this is called out as a specific use case, it's not exclusive in terms of, this is not the only professional learning you could potentially offer your teachers with Esser funds. You could certainly look at back up to category 4 and say, how are we providing professional learning for our teachers to really meet the needs of some of our English learners? And that would be a very appropriate use case, even though it's not explicitly called out like this one in number 6 is. 7 is going to be procuring supplies to sanitize and clean the facilities. This has been true for a lot of our schools in terms of needing to expand the custodial services and staff related to, making sure that frequently touched surfaces such as doorknobs and light switches are things that are cleaned more frequently. And so Esser funds can be used to that regard. All right. 8 is going to be planning activities around long-term closures. This includes the meal components, providing technology, and being able to extend services in alignment with IDEA and consistent with all of our requirements. 9 is the Ed Tech allowance, where we look at hardware, software, and connectivity. which includes connectivity at the home, not just in the school building. We'll touch on some of those resources in addition related to that in a little bit. 10 is going to be providing mental health supports and services. It's important to note that the impacts are not just academic, they are certainly social and emotional, and that they're not just on our students, they also expand to our teachers and staff. So it's important to note when looking at providing mental health supports and services that those are expansive to the full community that you serve in regards to a potential use case in addressing a need due to COVID-19. 11 is going to be the summer learning and after school programs, noting that many of our LEAs are moving that direction in terms of being able to provide additional academic and social emotional opportunities for our students that may have had their academics impacted either due to remote, blended, or disrupted learning. So this provides an allowance related to that effort. 12 is going to be addressing learning loss. I know in our state, we like to refer to it, as Superintendent Dixon says, as disrupted learning. For the federal guidance, though, we want to give you the language that we receive from our legislation, and that is to address learning loss. And it does note a couple of key use cases in there, such as administering high quality assessments to be able to gauge the progress of students and the impacts that may have occurred due to COVID-19. B is going to be implementing evidence-based activities to really meet the needs of students. C is providing information and assistance to parents and families on how they can better support their students at home to complement the work that's happening in the classroom. And D is going to be around tracking student attendance and improving student engagement, which has definitely been a big conversation in our community, as we've noted a lot more of our students being in a remote, blended, or even a once-a-day digital asynchronous learning space. 15 is going to be other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation and continuity of services in local education agencies. So we end with, or start with a really broad one with ESEA, and we end with a really broad one, which is really looking at what is necessary to maintain and continue your services, as well as employing existing staff of the local education agency. So this would really be a much larger use case if we were like many other states and we had significant cuts in our education budget. That is not us, very fortunate to the state of Utah. But if it was, this would have been a really essential clause to be able to operate. Now, if you look at this slide, you're probably thinking to yourself, Sarah, you can't count because we go from 12 to 15. And that is correct, because we have two specific use cases in 13 and 14 that have a slightly different lens to them that we want to highlight as different than the other federal allowable use cases. So this is going to be use cases that trigger a state reverse match. So I'll explain what that is. Basically, these are allowable use cases when it comes to the federal guidance related to these funds, meaning that you can technically use these funds to spend on either of these use cases, which really highlight kind of school facility and capital repairs related to building needs. The second one being more around HVAC systems, in terms of being able to improve air quality and mitigation of COVID-19. So as I said, you can technically spend on these items. However, if you choose to do so due to state legislation in House Bill 2 and ultimately Senate Bill 3, if an LEA chooses to spend their allocations in either of these ways, their state education funding will be reduced dollar for dollar, hence a reverse match. So basically, you may spend this way, but you ultimately then risk your state education dollars being reduced by the amount that you spend in these categories. It effectively makes these categories non-use cases. However, it is possible it just has a negative repercussion, and we like our LEAs to be very familiar with that so that they aren't surprised if they choose to spend their funds this way, what are part of the next steps. So we did issue these awards to the field. We had to kind of withdraw the applications and push pause and then ask you to resubmit due to some of the unexpected policy decisions that were being made during the state legislative session. And we've received all of those applications by the end of the month. So I mentioned that there's also a Gear 2. And so as far as Gear 2 goes, again, Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund. Currently, myself, Dr. Donaldson, and others at USBE are working with the governor's staff to be able to identify specific needs in the K-12 educational space, similar to the Gear 1 awards that were issued back in summer of 2020. At this point, those specific use cases and populations have not been determined, but it is something that we are working on. And once it's available, we'll release it in the Utah Grants Management System. These funds will also have the same obligation date as ESSER 3, which is September 30th, 2023. And I will also note that in recent conversations with the governor's office, they are most likely planning on holding Gear 2 until after we get through ESSER 3. So really looking at outcomes related to ESSER 3 and then where can Gear 2 serve to kind of address some of the holes or gaps that we have in that system. Additional federal awards that came through the second Appropriation Act. This one is the Utah Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, or Eems. So this program is really specific to providing direct supports from USBE as the SEA to the non-public schools. So I note this for you because it does have a pretty big impact on LEAs, which is that Utah LEAs do not need to provide equitable services related to Gear 2 or ESSER 2. Now, to clarify, you do for ESSER 1 and Gear 1, you just do not for the second round of funding. And so as part of that, if you have private school partners that you work with who may have reached out saying, okay, what does it look like for the next round? We highly encourage you and appreciate you directing them to our State Board of Education website where this particular program is defined. I will let you all know that our first rounds of application are due by the end of this month. As of today, we've had 3 schools apply. So this is one where we appreciate you getting the word out. For what it's worth, we've gone through all of our school directory contacts. We've reached out to all of our private school organizations and kind of central hubs to be able to get the word out. But again, if it's something where you're already coordinating on equitable services related to CARES, ESSER 1 and Gear 1, we appreciate you referring those same schools to our website to learn more about what their opportunities are for the future, because they will not come through equitable services with you specific to these 2 funding streams. All right. That too seems like a lot. Could there be more? There is. So the tree keeps giving. In terms of round 3, this is the American Relief Plan Act, or the ARPA. And this is the federal legislation that was passed in March of 2021. So for this particular round, we're going to give you kind of the high level of where the agency's going, since the formal program has not been published or released from our state at this time. So you're getting a preview of what's to come, but know that we're still working on some of the more specific details and logistics, and we'll be able to share that information in future Title I director settings. So as far as the American Rescue Plan Act goes, this was a little over $122 billion that went out to state education agencies. There are specific requirements for the state set aside that I'll touch on here in just a moment. And there's also a new specific requirement related to the LEA awards that did not exist in previous legislative efforts. We also like to highlight that the funding was also extended to our institutes of higher education and was also extended to the governors for the private schools program. So this would be another iteration of that emergency assistance for non-public schools, or Eems program, meaning that there is not an expectation for equitable services provided by LEAs for this upcoming round 3. So let's break down what it looks like for our state. So we are, our award is projected at a little over $615 million. So again, just the history, CARES was 67 million. The second Coronavirus Supplemental Act was 274 million. This is 615 million. So about 2.25 times what was received in the second round. As a part of that, we will be distributing over 550 million of that to the 90% LEA awards in the Title 1A distribution. In the state reserve, which is going to be the remaining kind of 61 million, we have 5% of it that as a state, we are required to put towards projects, contracts, services, and awards that address learning loss. So that is over 30 million, but a little under 31 million in terms of efforts our agency will have to take to direct those funds to those specific use cases. In addition to that, 1% of the total award has to go towards evidence-based summer enrichment programs, and an additional 1% has to go towards evidence-based comprehensive after-school programs. Now, I'll note, this is in addition to the LEA awards. And these are requirements that exist at the SEA, not at the LEA. So you are welcome to certainly fund those experiences. You just don't have the federal requirement that we do related to those efforts. I can let you know that we are in early conversations with a lot of our partners, both internal to the agency, our staff who work on the 21st century community grants, as well as the Utah After School Network, and many of our student academic achievement experts here within the agency, as well as their LEA counterparts, to really start looking at each of these requirements and starting to make decisions about what are our goals and outcomes, and then how do we create a mechanism related to funding those goals and outcomes. It's possible that these could be another grant application. It's also possible that these could be specific awards that are funded out directly. It could be a competitive grant application. There's a lot of options on the table, which is why we're starting with the conversation of what is our goal and intended outcome before getting into those details about then how do we build the logistics to achieve that. As far as the requirements that are new for our LEAs in terms of the new legislation, we already touched on this requirement that 20% of funds that are received in Esser 3 or Esser ARP, depending on who you talk to, have to be used to address learning loss for academic, social, and emotional needs. So that will be a required element of the plan, is demonstrating what specific actions are our LEAs taking to address this specific learning loss, and then demonstrating that 20% of your budget goes to support those activities as well. In addition, the federal legislation included a new allowable use case, which in addition to the 15 that were previously shared, this would be number 16, developing strategies and implementing public health protocols, including the greatest extent practicable, policies in line with the guidance for the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention to the reopening and safe management of schools. Basically supporting activities as are defined in the CDC school reopening guide that's been released to the community. Last but not least, there is a requirement both at the SEA level as well as the LEA level that requires a maintenance of equity. So this is an interesting kind of new approach in terminology, but the maintenance of equity basically speaks to that if you are a recipient of these awards, either at a state level or a local level, you cannot disproportionately cut funding to high poverty districts and schools. So you couldn't say like, well, we only have enough funding to run after school programs at 2 of our 5 schools, and we're going to cut it from the 3 schools that happen to be high poverty. So again, we're in a different situation here in the state of Utah in the fact that our state education dollars have not been reduced in response to COVID-19. So we're less concerned about our LEAs maintaining this requirement, but we do like to highlight it because it is a part of the assurances you'll see in the upcoming application. In addition to the programs that I've outlined for our awards direct to K-12, there's 2 additional awards that are worth highlighting in terms of being a supplement to address community needs that then frees up some of your money to be able to address other needs. And that's going to be the broadband resources. So there's two programs. The first is the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So this goes through our traditional E-rate program through our partners at the Utah Education Telehealth Network, or UEN. And this is about providing funding to support home internet access and connected devices. So any questions related to that fund, the allowable use case, the process you go through, really should be directed at Jerome Browning, who's our state E-rate expert. But I note it because we have seen LEAs using their Esser dollars to be able to support broadband needs. And it's important to note that there is a separate pool available with this new legislation that may eliminate your need to provide it directly from the LEA moving forward. The second item is the emergency broadband benefit. So whereas the first one is specific to E-rate at schools and libraries, this one is going to come through the internet providers. So a participating provider can provide up to $50 a month towards internet services for families that qualify. They can also provide up to $75 for households on tribal lands and up to $100 towards a computer if the provider so chooses. So the qualifications at a high level are listed to the side, which includes all of our students and families who already qualify for the Lifeline Telephone Broadband Program. If a student received free or reduced school lunch. So this one's a little tricky because that was expanded to everyone this past school year. They're relying on benefits that were received, not qualified, but received for the 2019-2020 school year is the data set related to that. Federal Pell Grant awardees experienced a loss of income, which is detailed in more direct qualifiers in the actual programs, and then participating in low-income internet or existing COVID-19 programming that has already been made available by the providers. Again, this comes direct through our providers, so our Comcasts, our CenturyLinks, and we'll be able to provide schools additional information as those providers launch their programs related to how families can access these services, which again then allows for a little more flexibility of funds, not necessarily always having to go to broadband moving forward. So this is a large image, and I share it with you not to overwhelm, but more so to just demonstrate that of all the funding we have articulated, we are still a small piece of a greater pie. And so when you consider all of the different federal emergency relief funding that has been received by the state, it extends far beyond K-12. And so it's important to note that because I think a lot of times as schools, we end up being kind of the house and home that provides services for everything under the sun related to COVID-19. And it's important to note that there are other programs and agencies in the state who are also receiving funding, who are valuable partners in this work. And it's worthwhile communicating with those partners so that we can make sure we're not duplicating efforts because the time is the most valuable resource that we have, and we want to make sure that our time is going towards very specific interventions that aren't already available in the greater field. Last but not least, I've referenced this a couple of times, but I like to kind of highlight it for the group. Many states are in different states of kind of economic challenge in regards to diminishing tax bases related to impacts of COVID-19 on their business and industry sectors. We are not in the state of Utah. And as a part of that, I highlight the recent outcomes of our Utah legislative session, where not only was funding maintained to K-12 education, but it was increased. And so as opposed to having to use our Esser funds to be able to backfill and supplement or supplant some of our previous activities, all of our LEAs really should be in a space of saying, no, I can use this money to be very targeted towards needs due to COVID-19, as opposed to needing to backfill a reduction in state dollars, because that is not our reality here in Utah. So a couple of questions to consider. And again, these slides are shared. So this is more so for conversations with you, your team, your fellow colleagues at your LEA. But I encourage all of our leaders to really consider the first question. So in our initial response to Esser 1, we were in this space of having to not only be in the space of triage in terms of what are we doing for remote learning, but also having to look into this crystal ball that nobody knew what was coming in regards to COVID-19. And that was a real challenge then in terms of, so what do I need in this situation? Being a year out from that, we have additional information. So I encourage you to pause before you jump into these are use cases, and ask yourself the question, what were and currently are the impacts of COVID-19 on our students, our teachers, and our schools? Starting with that basic question really gives you an opportunity to say, so what are the major impacts? And really frame your lens around response to those as your primary effort. The second question I encourage you to ask is then, what data sets do we already have that help inform the extent of those impacts? For this, we encourage our LEAs to really think about whatever their use case is there a data set that could inform that we have that could be compared from prior to March 13, 2020, the national date of national emergency, to now? And how do we look at those to see what is the impact, and is it something that we have measures related to so that we can be that much more targeted and data-based decision-making in terms of our next steps? Question 3 is also an important one, which is, how have we already spent our early COVID-19 response funding? So again, there was a lot of quick decisions that had to be made. Some of those decisions turned out to be really effective, some of them not so much. And so as a part of that, considering what have we spent on, and did that work and help address some of our needs for COVID-19? Do we want to continue in that pathway? Or are there certain components where we're like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that again, because we ended up shifting and finding a better solution and next steps forward. Last but not least, asking yourself as an LEA the question, what is our plan for schools in the future? So although we are looking at some new state legislation in terms of the end of the state mask mandate, moving forward to the end of the school year related to changes in regards to COVID-19 thresholds, as well as some of the PPE requirements at the state level, it's still important to note that many of our schools are in a space of saying, well, due to the disruption, we now have families that expect to have access to remote and blended learning opportunities. And how are we going to continue that in the fall? What is our plan? What does that vision look like? And how are we using these funds to support the continuation of those models to help respond to COVID-19? So we started with this, I end with this. How can I use this funding to demonstrate what would happen if we increased investment in education? We've gone through a lot of different funding streams that are out there. There are a lot of different puzzle pieces that are related to creating a comprehensive picture of what your LEA response looks like in terms of COVID-19. And I encourage you through those questions, as well as this one, to really consider it through the lens of funding the plan, in terms of what you're already doing locally and using your resources to support those efforts, as opposed to creating more of like a shopping list of items related to your federal relief dollars. So that is the end of the formal presentation. It looks like we have about 10 more minutes. Myself and Becky Donaldson are available for questions, but for those of you who are moving on to your next meeting, I appreciate your time, and we're here to stick around to answer any questions. So thank you.
Sarah, I have a question.
Yes.
I was just wondering, what is the target date to know what our allocations will be for the ESSER 3?
It's a great question. So it's a question that I didn't have the answer to when I created the slide deck last week, but I have an answer now. So I appreciate you asking. So currently our target is to release the allocations application and a guidance document by June 15th, 2020. We will then plan on having those applications due to our office by August 20th, 2020. So that is an extended application timeline, noting that the month of July is challenging for many of our LEAs in terms of 11-month contract situations. But also, or sorry, I'm saying 2020. I mean to say 2021. Thank you for that correction, Patrick. So we're talking about releasing on June 15th, 2021, having it be due August 20th, 2021. And that will give LEAs time to be able to develop a more comprehensive kind of plan and response and not feel as rushed as they have with the previous efforts. So thank you, Arlene.
A follow-up question to that.
Yep.
So with Esser 2, we had our plan, we were able to submit it, and then you reviewed it and you gave us an approval so that we could, for instance, if we're going to be hiring people for, for those funds to help in our plan. So would we have that same kind of format? And if we find out allocations are in June, and then, or do we have to wait till August 20th to know whether we have it approved? Does that make sense?
Yep, it totally does. Great question. So although the due date is August 20th, 2021, as an agency, we review those plans on a rolling basis as they come in. So let's say like you already know what you're doing and you're able to put together your application within like 5 days. So let's say June 20th, like you're done and you're ready to go. You will submit that and our office will take it through the review process. Generally, between our program team as well as our financial operations reviews, most of those outcomes are coming within 2 to 3 business days. So we act very quickly related to those outcomes. And once you have that award in hand, that gives you then the paperwork you need to be able to move forward with those hires.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
You bet.
Do we know more or less about how much our award will be to each district, or how is that going to be notified?
So yeah, it's a great question. So if your award was received through the 90% kind of Title 1A allocation, it's about 2.25 the amount you received in round 2. That's a great way to estimate it, not necessarily down to the dollar, but to give you a really good sense of what that's going to look like. If you received money through the SEA reserve, that conversation is actually still happening and will need to be approved by our State Board of Education. So they ultimately authorize the release of reserve funding. And so staff at our office is currently working on draft allocation models for them to consider in terms of us being able to provide more clarity about what a state base might look like for round 3. All right, looks like those were Aaron's questions too.
Hey, Sarah, this is Gary Warwood. Hey, question. You said that we have to spend our Esser 1 money first before we get reimbursed for Esser 2. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What about Esser 3? Do we have to spend Esser 2 money all the way before we get reimbursed for Esser 3?
Yes. So that is the current kind of form and function related to the federal award guidelines. And so as far as being able to seek direct reimbursement, you have to have expended your previous federal awards before you can access the new award. A couple of things that I'll note about that. So first and foremost is that because the use cases are pretty similar from 1 to 2 to 3, it is possible if you're like, okay, we're in a bit of a cash flow situation where some of our activities from Esser 2 need to happen, and we're still working on expending Esser 1 through September 30th. It is possible to do a budget revision and move some of those activities into your original Esser 1 award so that you aren't strapped for cash related to achieving those activities. The other component is to be able to then say, okay, because we've noted this is true for a lot of our LEAs, because there's so much money that's out there and it's a lot of administrative work to request reimbursement, is being able to talk with your BAs about, do we already have these Esser 1 funds spent? We just haven't asked for reimbursement yet. In which case you want to get that documentation in and submitted to be able to open you up for the second round.
I think a bigger question is if we start spending, if we're done with Esser 1, we start Esser 2, And now we have this plan for ESSER 3. If we're hiring people with ESSER 3, we can't get reimbursed until ESSER 2 is all done, and that could take most of the year in order to get that paid. And if we're using ESSER 3 money already, then we won't get any reimbursements until we finish ESSER 2, which could be the whole year. And that, I guess that's kind of a difficult thing.
No, and I certainly appreciate that. I mean, so like full transparency, when we released ESSER 2, even initially with the timeline, so ESSER 3, although discussed, was not official by any stretch of the imagination. And so in the same way that you are trying to kind of make a plan and then, oh, wait, there's more money, so now we have a new plan. I think that once we have kind of all of the allocations out there, it is worthwhile for every LEA to sit down and look at, here is the funding we have in each plan. What is the timeline for activities? And how do we then adjust our existing budgets for our previously approved and upcoming awards to match our timeline for activities? So related to like the hiring of individuals, looking at, okay, so how do I then look at my existing funding and say, can I make a modification to spend down all of my ESSER 1 related to those initial hires to move us forward, and really kind of line those pieces up. I think for what it's worth, everyone is in that space, including the state, in terms of saying, okay, well, we were planning on 2. Now that we have 3, we may need to take a step back, look at our timeline of activities, and then realign those to the appropriate sources through the grants management system.
And would you go over one more time when each of those are expire for ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, just to clarify that?
Yep. So ESSER 1 and Gear 1 is September 30th, 2022. ESSER 2 and Gear 2 is 2023. And then ARPA is going to be September 30th, 2024.
So if we have a plan in place by August of this year, is that something that we could say, hey, we're not going to really touch that money until maybe the beginning of 2022, the fiscal year, maybe for 2023, I guess is.
Yes, I mean, that is certainly possible. And what I would say is that if that is going to be the case in terms of the submission of your award, you would just want to provide that as a short narrative context, right? So that a reviewer who's looking at your new plan, who may not have seen your previous 2 plans, just has some quick background highlights of, we're using our ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funding in these ways. Therefore, our ESSER 3 money is going to be held until this date to be able to address activities moving forward. I would think that is a max of 2 sentences in terms of just making sure that clarity is available for the reviewers so they understand your approach.
Because I think it's almost important to see what happens with ESSER 1, ESSER 2 to see how effective our things are. And then we say, oh, we need to change because we might see a plan right now, but after it starts in place, then we say, wait a minute, this is not working. We need to do this and this. And so is that something we could go back and adjust our ESSER 3 plan and say, hey, we want a budget revision. We want to change some things out of that. Is that possible?
Yep, it is completely possible. And I would say more than possible, it's most likely probable for every single LEA. So I'll say that we've even seen that with the original awards. So, when we asked folks like, what are you going to need in May of 2020 to be able to, reopen your schools, the main focus was PPE. That was what everybody needed, PPE. Well, then it turned out that the state allocated money specific to PPE in the special legislation, as well as the state reserve, our agency, providing additional supplemental resources. So for many LEAs, they were like, well, our initial plan was PPE, but we don't actually have that need anymore to the extent we thought we would. We now need to spend it on, some of our more remote and blended learning opportunities that many of our LEAs open the school with. That's a simple budget revision through the grants management tool in terms of being able to make those shifts. And as staff, we're here to help make those shifts as quickly as possible because we want you to know that we appreciate the changing nature of the field and that we support you in making those changes based on what's working.
So
Sarah, I have another question. Oh, I'm sorry, Gary. Go ahead.
just one more question. I'm sorry to take up so much time. But on the funds that are going to the internet providers, how are the families going to be involved in knowing that information? Is that coming through us telling them and us reaching out to our disadvantaged families that need this information and saying, okay, you can contact these providers and they have information for you? How is that going to work, or do you even know?
No, so I love that question because for those of you who don't know, my previous background was in digital teaching and learning, so I am very invested in the broadband space and what we're doing collectively. So a couple of responses there. First and foremost is that currently USBE, UETN, the GoEd Broadband Office, our Utah State Libraries, and a couple other organizations who are in this space are collectively creating both flyers and bookmarks and handouts that can go in take home school lunches that will then be available to all of our LEAs to help promote the program. The point of having those resources prepared is that then those programs are messaged the same way, and our families don't feel like, well, I heard about one program at the libraries. Is that the same that I heard about through my school? That it's like, nope, it's all the same, and that it's really, really clear. So we expect to have those materials released by the end of April at the very latest. The drafts are already available. We're just waiting on the finalization of the provider list so that we have that linked appropriately so folks know who they can go to. So that's kind of answer one. Answer two is that when it comes to the program that's coming through E-rate, there is the potential for overlap. So you may have a family that is telling you, like, we need services, that you can provide services through the E-rate program that also may qualify to go through a provider. Because these are two new programs that are kind of in a Venn diagram, share some of that space together, we will defer to the LEA on what you think really makes the most sense related to individual family needs. I'll give a quick example so that we can move on to other questions. But an example would be currently there are existing programs available to families even prior to the pandemic related to broadband. Some of our LEAs have chosen to partner with those providers and really promote those programs like Comcast Internet Essentials. Other LEAs have, noted that their families were not successful in signing up for those programs for one reason or another and chose to provide hotspots directly. So it's really a question of what your community needs are in terms of looking at the available resources and then making choices about how, as an LEA, you want to message it to your families.
Thank you.
You bet.
So Sarah, my quick question was, this presentation that you've done today, are our business administrators going to get the same and our superintendents, or are we the only ones getting this information?
Oh no, we're a road show.
Yeah.
So for what it's worth, we will be doing another update for business administrators. I'll note the business administrator one includes different information, mainly specific to some of the reimbursement paperwork requirements that are necessary for these programs. So they do have slightly different kind of components to that information, but they're getting kind of the same broad overview. We've done this presentation with curriculum directors as well as with some of our specific title groups. We presented with Dr. Foster and for some of our leaders for our Native American students earlier last week, and we'll continue to do that moving forward. The last thing I'll say, and this isn't just for Arlene, but for anyone who's on. So at the upcoming Utah Rural Schools Conference that's happening in July in Richfield, I have a specific session that will not be this, but will focus on walking LEAs through, kind of to the earlier point from Gary, let's take a step back. Let's look at the timeline of activities that we have planned for response for COVID. And then how do we manage and modify our budgets and our plans to be able to meet those timelines. So that'll be one of the options at Utah Rural Schools. It's really directed at kind of our district administrators, not as much really our classroom practitioners. So you'd be welcome to join me there for that conversation as well.
Thank you.
You bet. All right. Well, I know we're a little over time, but thank you for bearing with me. These were all really, really great questions. I appreciate it. Again, if you have any additional questions, you are always welcome to reach out to myself and Becky. We actually like when you email both of us together, because then it's always a race to see who can get to it first. I'll be honest, Becky is hard to beat, man. She is so fast. But it just helps us in terms of making sure we get you a response as soon as possible. Appreciate your time today and wish you the best in the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Sarah, I didn't get to finish writing down everything on the award part. So can you go through that for me one more time?
You bet. So for the upcoming Esser ARP or Esser 3. Yep. So we will expect to release the application on June 15th, 2021. We expect it to be due to the office on August 20th, 2021. And as far as projecting how, what the amount of resources you'd be looking at, you want to take your Esser 2 90% award and multiply it by 2.25. So a little over double.
Okay. Thank you. Now I got it. I appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Happy to help.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Becky.
Bye.
All right. So Becky, I will send you I guess you already have the link to all of the slides because we put it in the Zoom. But let me know if there's anything else you need. And yeah, thanks for setting this up. I really appreciate it.
Okay, when we get the record, and then we'll make sure that gets sent out to everyone. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I will see you, Becky, this afternoon.
yeah,
For
so we'll see you at 4 o'clock.
Okay, sounds good.